This video is sponsored by Presto Music, the UK's leading e-commerce site for classical and jazz recordings, including some of mine. More about them at the end of the show. Bells. Bells, 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 bells. Little bells, big bells, really clanking giant bells. Bells to tell you she is wed, bells to tell you he is dead. Cycle bells, disciple bells, free bells, sea bells, fire bells, spire bells, school bells and Yule bells. Bells that tinkle, bells that bong, bells that jingle, bells that dong. Winning bells and spinning bells, bells that charm and bells that grate. Healing bells and peeling bells, bells that tintinnabulate. Bells with clappers, bells with hammers, bells you ring, bells that swing, bells for fingers, bells with ropes, bells for people, bells for goats. Ashanti bells and Shinto bells, Burmese bells and Hindu bells, English, Russian, Jewish, Amish, French, Dutch and Danish bells. Bells to say the day's begun, bells to say the war is won, bells to show that you've got power, bells to tell you what's the hour. Jingle bells, single bells, drinking bells, sinking bells, hell's bells and hotel bells, turn off now bells, where's the cowbells? Bells, 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 bells. Bells come in all shapes and sizes and are used in all sorts of ways by cultures all over the world. But what really shocked me the more I looked into it was just how much influence bells and the music played on bells has had on all kinds of music, from rock and pop to classical and jazz. So today we're going to explore the love affair humans have with bells. And by humans I'm including the weird subset known as composers. For composers like me, the unique quality of bells and the music played on them is an endless source of fascination and inspiration. One of the first bell sounds that really struck me, if you'll forgive the pun, was the sound of multiple bells all swinging away at their own speed that I must have heard somewhere on holiday in Europe as a kid. It was probably the first time that my ears registered the concept of a polyrhythm, where the tone of one bell gradually catches up, syncs with, and then overtakes another. We'll look at what it is that draws humans to the sound of bells, and how composers make use of and imitate that in their compositions. And as we progress, see if you can pinpoint the one thing that all these diverse sounds and traditions have in common. So let's start with the actual sound a bell makes, and you might be tempted to wonder what's all the fuss about. After all, bells are really just lumps of metal, tin fused with copper or sometimes iron, that you strike with some kind of beater. You could see them as the most brain-dead of instruments. You can really only get one sound of them. They're literally the one-hit wonders of the music world. But bells are actually quite unique in the way that they produce pitch. Some instruments have no pitch at all, like a snare drum or a cymbal. That's white noise, which is just loads of pitches all at once, which for our ears equals basically no pitch. But if an instrument is going to produce a specific pitch, you can usually feel pretty confident about which pitch it is. So to recap very quickly how all this works, most conventional instruments produce a tone that has a main tone called a fundamental, and then other quieter tones, the harmonics, above, which all blend together to produce the overall tone of the instrument. The harmonics form the harmonic series, this one in fact, and they behave in a nice, neat, orderly fashion. So this one, the second harmonic, is half the wavelength of the first, and this one, the third, is a third of the wavelength, this one is a fourth, and so on, all the way up. And the main difference from one instrument to another is the relative strengths of each of these harmonics. So here, for example, is a low C on the piano. So you can see the fundamental, the main tone here, and all the harmonics that are sounding at the same time here. Notice here it's actually the first overtone that's louder than the fundamental most of the time, with each of the higher harmonics sounding gradually quieter. Play the same tone on another instrument, say the bassoon, and you'll get the same harmonics but just in different strengths. So here on the bassoon you can see that the harmonics actually increase in loudness, with a particularly loud seventh harmonic, the flattened B flat over the C fundamental. So if you ever think of a bassoon as having a quite nasal or even slightly dissonant tone, that'll be why. But just to repeat, these two instruments, and in fact pretty much every other pitched instrument except for bells, use exactly the same harmonic series to create the pitch. It's just the different strengths of the harmonics that change. But bells are the rebellious exception to this rule. If you've ever heard a bell strike and not been sure which pitch is sounding, or perhaps you've heard two or more tones at once, you're aware of the issue. So what's going on? Well, it all comes down to the upper tones, sometimes called partials, which are not nearly as orderly as the harmonics on other instruments. A bell's partials don't always correspond neatly to divisions of a main tone. They're what's known as inharmonic, so the result is more complicated. Sometimes, in fact, it's so complicated an effect known as the missing fundamental kicks in. Here's a bell from a new cathedral in Bucharest, which is theoretically tuned to a low C. To me, there are two pretty clear sounds here. There's the low C itself, but there's also an F up here. But if you look at the audio spectrum of the bell, there's no sign of this F at all. There's an E flat here, and we'll come on to that in a second, but there's no sign of the F, even though it's quite clearly audible. Apparently the F is generated in our brains because in that complicated mishmash of upper harmonics, there are enough notes corresponding to the upper harmonic series of the F that our brains fill in the gaps and we hear the low F fundamental, even though it's not actually there. Now, I don't want to give the impression that bells can't be tuned. They very much can, usually by shaving small bits of metal off the inside of the bell after it's been cast. It's a process that today is controlled by computers, and you can imagine how the further back in time you go, the more hit and miss tuning becomes. But even today it's a complicated process, not fully understood. In Western music, most church bells have their lower partials tuned to the intervals of 2 octaves, an octave, a minor third and a fifth, forming a minor chord, which is perhaps one of the reasons bells can have a solemn or mournful quality, and it's why we saw that E flat above the C in the Bucharest bell. But in Russian bells, where the focus is on rhythm, the aim is to make the bell as distinctive as possible, so the tuning there varies widely. For now, what we can say for sure is that bell sounds are unusual, different from most other instruments, and contain an element of mystery or uncertainty, which is surely part of their charm. But do keep that interval of a fourth from C to F in mind, because we'll be coming back to it. So now let's think about how, as composers, we might go about imitating the tone of the bell. For a deep gong-like bell sound, composers like Franz Liszt or the highly underrated Charles Alkan sometimes used a single low note on the piano, which is effective enough. The very lowest notes on the piano have quite gong-like levels of pitch instability. Wagner clearly had some kind of soft resonant sound in mind when he imagined what he called the crystal bells in his opera Parsifal. But he struggled to find the precise bell sound he wanted. Church bells were just too rich in upper overtones for his purpose. Tam-tams were no good, they produce white noise rather than specific pitches. Wagner even improvised various constructions to try to get the bell sound he wanted, one using huge metal drums, and another using an upright piano frame with 4 strings sounding each note. To this day, orchestras struggle to find practical and affordable solutions. Possibly the beautiful sound of the Thai gong would be closer to what he had in mind, though these can cost upwards of $30,000 each. But there are other ways that you can capture a little more of the mystery of the sound of a bell. The coronation scene from Mussorgsky's opera Boris Godunov starts with an imitation of a deep bell sound. A low C on the piano, harps, tubas and bassoons coloured by the tam-tam. But then Mussorgsky adds in 2 unusual chords above. Firstly a D7, effectively a third inversion with the C forming the base of the chord. And then an A flat 7, a tritone away from the first chord. This is suddenly not functional harmony in the way that's existed for hundreds of years. These are 2 chords that just sit there alternating back and forth. I would argue that they're effectively imitating just one bell sound, a blend of the two harmonic series and all their overtones clashing away in the upper register, just like we saw in that bell from Bucharest. And Grieg is taking a similar approach in his more gentle Glockengelaute, or bell ringing, from his lyric pieces Opus 54. And here we can see some of those fourths that we saw in the huge bell from Bucharest. The pedal is held down and the overtones from the C and the F are left to mingle together overhead, just as they do in the real bell. Above this, Grieg imitates the sound of higher bells in a way that feels very typical and natural at the piano. Open fifths. So for smaller bells like this, the complexities of the sound are less obvious, and it's just those initial couple of partials which are audible. So a good approximation on the piano is the perfect fifth, and perhaps a fourth above to complete the octave. But once you start playing a tune using this kind of sound, things again start to take a slightly strange turn. The jazz pianist Red Garland was imitating bell sounds reasonably enough on the track If I Were a Bell. Garland was famous for using a style of piano playing known as block chords, where the chord shape stays the same even as the melody moves around. So to take one of these bell sounds in the upper piano and move it around over the melody would be an absolutely obvious thing for him to do. But watch what happens when he keeps those open fifths. So in the left hand you've got a G minor 7 with a B flat. But the bell sound adds an added fifth, the B natural, completely at odds with the B flat in the chord below. This is what jazz pianist and composer Ethan Iverson calls a subtle act of rebellion against the major-minor tonal system which had held authority for so long. It's a small but typical example of the way that imitating bell sounds pushes composers outside of their box in terms of harmony. As Iverson says, when a composer summons bells at the piano, it's a way to undo conventional harmony. You can see a quite similar example from classical music in another piece by Charles Alkan, the Etude Le Festin des Scopes. Alkan holds a repeating 4-note pattern high in the piano's right hand, which keeps going even as it clashes quite dramatically with the lower voices. You can see the E natural again clashing with the E sharp below. But perhaps the most far-reaching innovation bell sounds inspired in both jazz and classical composers was the increased importance placed on the interval of the perfect fourth. We've already seen how the fourth is an important part of a typical bell sound, whether it's deep in the bass of those large church bells or higher up on those piano chords imitating smaller bells. And for composers, the fourth offered fresh harmonic possibilities after centuries of chords built entirely out of major and minor thirds. Stacked one on top of another, fourths give you quite an open, floating kind of sound. Ravel uses them to great effect in his bell piece La Vallée des Cloches. Possibly as a direct influence from composers like Ravel, the stacked fourth, or quartal harmony as it became known, made its way into jazz and became a key part of the style of jazz greats like Bill Evans, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea and above all McCoy Tyner. It's intriguing to imagine that one of the key developments of 20th century jazz harmony might have its origins in the sound of a bell. But the surprisingly large influence of the bell doesn't stop there. Let's turn now to bell patterns and bell rhythms, and specifically the clave. The clave is a rhythmic pattern used as a foundation or backbone to Afro-Cuban music and throughout Latin America. You may be familiar with this one. It's known as the son clave, but also known as the Bo Diddley beat and lots of other names. These days it's heard in all kinds of genres from all over the world. It's been called the world's most popular rhythm. Many other claves exist throughout South America and the Caribbean, each one forming the essential characteristic of that genre's rhythms. But all these clave rhythms didn't start out on these things, the claves, or the claves as I've always known them. They started out on something more like this. A bell of a kind found in Central and West African countries like Ghana or Niger. These rhythms came across to the Americas with the transatlantic slave trade. Presumably the slaves weren't able to bring metal bells with them, so they ended up on those wooden sticks, but their origins lie firmly on the bell, and you can still hear the ancestors of the clave alive and well in many parts of Africa today. And many of them form intricate and interlocking patterns played by two or more players. And just as you find in Latin American music, including the son clave itself, there is considerable play between the 3/4 and the 6/8, to the extent that it's often hard to correctly locate the main beats. Ghanaian scholar Kofi Agawu suggests following the feet of dancers is the one sure way to discover where the beat lies. The kinds of polyrhythm found in African bell patterns had a particularly big influence on two classical composers, Steve Reich, who learned about them in A.M. Jones's landmark Studies in African Music, and later György Ligeti, who explored a distinctive feature of the clave rhythms, which A.M. Jones labelled as the cross rhythm, where the rhythmic conflict found in polyrhythms is the basis of an entire musical piece. Ligeti's fem, which means metal in Hungarian, has a distinctly bell-like quality. So now let's look at some other examples of traditions that involve multiple bells and the rhythms and patterns that they create. We've already heard one other kind of multi-belled music in the scene from Boris Godunov. Mussorgsky's striking music is a distillation of the traditional Russian Orthodox bell ringing style known as zvony. The bells are separated into multiple strata, with the lowest bells moving at the slowest speed and the highest ones moving faster above. It's an overall texture that reminds me a little bit of gamelan music, although we'll perhaps save that for another video. But I also want to shout out a less well-known but equally fabulous Slovenian form of bell ringing, which has a distinctive quality I really enjoy. And then there are ways that you can use multiple bells to create melodies, and this is one of the most popular things for composers to imitate in their own music. At its most basic, you can simply imitate two bells chiming one after another, like in William Byrd's The Bells, one of the earliest of the bell imitating compositions. The repeating bell tones on C and D in the bass form a pattern that lasts throughout the piece, like the simplest possible kind of ground bass. This piece by Marais extends the pattern to 3 notes. One of the most famous bell-related compositions is The Carol of the Bells. It's most famous in its Americanized form, but here's a taste of the original, written by the Ukrainian composer Mykola Leontovich in 1914. It uses a 4-note repeating pattern, but this could be performed using just 3 bells, the upper B producing a hemiola pattern a bit like the son clave. In fact, in the original Ukrainian text, this hemiola is actually emphasised, with the text shifting the accents between the 3/4 and the 6/8 feel. But what about more complex melodic patterns? Well, in 17th century England, new technology emerged, meaning that larger church bells could be mounted on a whole wheel. Multiple bells could now be controlled much more easily, and this led to the birth of composed patterns of notes known as change ringing. The 1668 book Tintinologia laid down some of the rules of the new art, where a series of bell patterns or methods could be played by gradually changing the order of the bells. Bells were played in a set order and could only move one position at a time, so it's a highly mathematical, algorithmic approach to composition. It's a bit like working out all the ways that you can play 3 notes at a piano. For 3 notes there are 6 options, for 4 there's 24, and for 7 you've got 5,040 permutations. And people do sometimes play a whole set of permutations, even though it takes many hours. John Jenkins, a 17th century English composer, wrote this piece inspired by these bell changes. But I think you can hear it has that mechanical quality which makes it quite limited for expressive kinds of music. But anyone working with more algorithmic approaches to composing, for example, a more minimalist style, might find this whole area quite interesting. And I could also imagine something similar being useful, for example, with modular synthesizers. So I wonder if you've pieced together yet what all these diverse kinds of music making with bells have in common. What's the one feature that encompasses or underpins all these different kinds of bell music? Well, we've got one last area to look at before you make up your mind, and that's what we might call the cultural resonance, the way bells are used and the purposes bells are put to in different cultures around the world. But again, I want to focus not just on their real world usage, but on how composers have incorporated that cultural resonance into their own work. We've already seen several examples of how bells are sometimes quite literally roped into service for many of the world's great religions. If you want to speak the word of God, you need a bell to announce it, and on the whole, the bigger the better. And similarly, if you want to bring a whole community together to announce a celebration or a death, or maybe both, bells are your go-to instrument. They're loud enough to carry across a long distance, and they possess this quite austere grandeur or solemnity that suits the purpose. The British composer Jonathan Harvey captures some of this cultural resonance in his pioneering electronic piece Mortuos, Plango, Vivos, Voco, which samples a large bell from Winchester Cathedral and mixes and blends it with the sound of a child chorister. For the piece, Harvey analysed the unusual audio spectrum of the bell, and he made individual partials from the bell the basis for sections of the piece. He also experimented with techniques like manipulating the tone of the child's voice so that it had the same envelope as a bell tone. To me, it's the majestic sound of the bell that's present in one form or another throughout the piece that lifts it beyond some kind of dry technical exercise and into a far more spiritual experience. Other composers have taken this solemn or spiritual side of the bell and made a slightly more cartoonish experience out of it. I hope Berlioz will forgive me for describing it like that, but in his Symphonie Fantastique, bells sound along with the Dies Irae, the 13th century motive used in the Requiem Mass, conjuring a witch's Sabbath scene, which is solemn, but, to me anyway, deeply ironic. But bells can be just as joyful as they are sombre. A joyful cacophony of bells is requested in Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, and here at the end of Mahler's Resurrection Symphony. This kind of jubilant bell ringing was famously sounded across the UK to signal the end of World War II, but what's often forgotten is that bells were initially ordered to fall silent at the start of the war so that they could be used as a warning even when the Germans invaded. It's hard to think of a better summation of the ability of bells to summon both joy and terror. And if you want to hear an example of a composer using bells in this more alarming way, there's none better than Shostakovich in his 11th Symphony. Bells are but clay that men refine and raise from duller ore. Yet now, as if they were divine, they call whole cities to adore. Exalted into steeples, they disperse their sound, and from on high chime in our souls. Those are lines from the poem Bells by Thomas Traherne, which I happen to have just finished setting to music. It's a new piece for choir and organ, commissioned by Wells Cathedral Choir, one of the top choirs in the country. It's due to have its premiere later this year, and if we get all the permissions sorted, I'll hopefully be able to share it with you here. So that will hopefully be a chance for you to hear my take on the world of bells. As if they were divine. There's one particular thing I think bells have in common with the divine, and it's the thing that I think ties all our different bells together, and that's what we might rather grandly call their immutability. A bell can often be quite a strange sound, but you know as soon as you've heard it that it's not going to change. It is what it is. With that unchanging insistence, it can summon, uplift or warn an entire community. With the repetition of the clave, it can form the immutable backbone to entire dances, or with the algorithmic compositions of change ringing, it forms patterns that, once started, only have one way to continue. You could say that when it comes to bells, the very thing that seems like their limitation is the thing that makes them so special. Those of you who use streaming services will know that they aren't always set up very well for classical and jazz recordings. Well, this video's sponsor, Presto Music, specialises in just that. They're a classical and jazz specialist, so you should find yourself right at home. In fact, they're the UK's leading site for all things music. They also have printed music, music books, and musical instruments. So here's another of my recordings, Avi Avital's world premiere recording of my piece Death is a Friend of Ours, my surprisingly jolly new piece out now on Deutsche Grammophon, and available on Presto as an MP3 download, as a high-res FLAC file, or as a physical disc. I'll just add that one to the basket. With over 1 million products, Presto offers an extensive catalogue to suit musicians and music lovers, accepting payment in 15 different currencies and shipping to over 200 countries worldwide. Use the link in the description with the voucher code DavidBruce to get £5 off when you spend £30 or more anytime in 2021. So that's it for now. If you enjoyed these videos, do please consider joining my patrons on Patreon, and thank you so much to everyone who already supports me there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.